The dusty streets of Columbia, California had never seen a woman quite like Victoria Wright, and by the third day of her arrival in the spring of 1874, the silver miners had already begun their foolish wager. Victoria had come west with her late father's mining claim papers clutched in her gloved hands, arriving on the afternoon stage with nothing but 2 trunks and a determination that burned brighter than the Sierra Nevada sun. Her father had died of pneumonia in San Francisco before ever seeing the claim he'd won in a card game, and Victoria, 22 years old and suddenly alone in the world, had decided she would see it through herself. She had copper-colored hair that caught the light like the ore the men sought underground, and eyes the color of spring grass that seemed to take in everything with a sharp intelligence that made lesser men uncomfortable. The miners noticed her immediately. Columbia was a town still flush with silver fever, though the easy pickings had long since passed. What remained required hard work, dangerous descents into the earth, and the kind of backbreaking labor that left men too exhausted for much beyond whiskey and cards at night. Women were scarce, and respectable single women were rarer than a 4-leaf clover in a desert. Victoria took a room at the boarding house run by Mrs. Harriet Chen, a widow who had come from China with her late husband during the gold rush days and had stayed on when he died in a tunnel collapse. Mrs. Chen was one of the few people in Columbia who didn't look at Victoria like she was either a prize to be won or a fool to be pitied. "You'll have trouble with the men," Mrs. Chen said plainly as she showed Victoria to a clean room on the second floor. "They see a woman alone, they think you need saving." "I don't need saving," Victoria replied, setting down her smallest trunk. "I need to file my claim and figure out how to work it." Mrs. Chen's weathered face creased into something that might have been approval. "The land office is 2 streets over. But Miss Wright, understanding the law and getting men to respect it are 2 different things out here." Victoria had already learned that lesson. At the land office that afternoon, the clerk, a balding man named Samuel Peters, had looked at her papers with barely concealed amusement. "This claim's been abandoned for near 2 years. You'll need equipment, men to work it, and capital you probably don't have." "The claim is legal," Victoria said firmly. "My father won it legally, and I've inherited it legally. I'm simply here to see it registered in my name." Peters had shrugged and done the paperwork, but his expression suggested he was humoring a child who would soon learn better. Victoria left the office with her jaw clenched and her papers properly filed, but the knot in her stomach reminded her that she truly had no idea what came next. That evening, she sat in the dining room of the boarding house, trying to ignore the stares from the other residents and planning her next move. She had enough money to last perhaps 2 months if she was careful. She needed to find someone trustworthy to assess the claim, and she needed to understand if working it was even feasible for someone in her position. The other boarders were mostly miners, men who worked claims for wages rather than owning their own. They were polite enough during supper, but Victoria could feel their eyes on her, assessing, wondering. Mrs. Chen served a simple but filling meal of beans, cornbread, and salt pork, and Victoria ate quickly, planning to retreat to her room. "Miss Wright," one of the miners said as she rose to leave. He was young, probably not yet 25, with sandy hair and earnest blue eyes. "I'm Thomas Fletcher. I heard tell you've got the old Grady claim up on the North Ridge." "That's correct," Victoria said carefully. "Well, madam, I've worked these parts for 3 years now. If you need someone to look over the claim, assess its potential, I'd be happy to help." His face flushed slightly. "No charge, of course, just neighborly." Before Victoria could respond, another miner stood up. This one was older, perhaps 30, with dark hair and a thick mustache. "Fletcher here's only been in these hills 3 years, Miss Wright. I'm Robert Patterson, and I've been working silver claims since before this town was properly chartered. I'd be better suited to help you." A third man rose, then a fourth, and soon half the dining room was offering their services. Victoria felt heat rising in her own cheeks, but not from pleasure at the attention. She could see the calculation in their eyes, the way they were sizing her up as opportunity rather than person. "Gentlemen," she said, raising her voice slightly to cut through the growing din, "I appreciate your offers. I'll certainly consider them. Good evening." She left the room with as much dignity as she could muster and climbed the stairs to her room, aware that every eye followed her. Once inside with the door locked, she sat on the bed and let out a long breath. This was going to be more complicated than she'd anticipated. What Victoria didn't know was that at that very moment, in the saloon 3 buildings down, a wager was taking shape. Thomas Fletcher had gone straight there after supper, as had Robert Patterson and 4 other miners who'd been at the boarding house. The liquor flowed, tongues loosened, and competitive male pride did the rest. "I'll have her agreement to let me survey the claim within a week," Fletcher boasted, emboldened by whiskey. "A week," Patterson laughed. "I'll have her accepting my help within 3 days. "You're both fools," said a grizzled miner named Jack Sutton. "A woman like that doesn't want boys or pretty words. She needs a man who can show her the practical side of things. I'll have her trust inside 2 days." The bet grew from there, fueled by alcohol and ego. 10 miners eventually put money into the pot, each convinced he'd be the first to win Victoria's favor. The terms were simple. Whoever could get Victoria to agree to let them help with her claim first would win the pot. They'd have the saloon keeper, Gerald Moore, hold the money and judge the winner. It was crude and disrespectful, but none of the men thought of it that way. To them, it was just sport, no different than betting on cards or horse races. That Victoria was a human being with her own thoughts, fears, and plans didn't factor into their whiskey-soaked reasoning. The next morning, Victoria woke early and dressed in the most practical clothing she owned. A simple brown dress with a sturdy skirt that wouldn't drag in the dirt, boots that had seen better days but would handle rough terrain, and a wide-brimmed hat to keep the sun off her face. She had decided overnight that she would ride out to see the claim herself, even if she didn't know exactly what to look for. It was hers, and she needed to lay eyes on it. Mrs. Chen provided directions and, after some hesitation, offered to let Victoria borrow her late husband's horse, a sturdy bay mare named Copper who was getting old but was still reliable. "You know how to ride?" Mrs. Chen asked. "Well enough," Victoria replied. She'd grown up in Sacramento, and her father had kept horses when she was young, before financial troubles had forced him to sell everything. She could manage. The ride out to the claim took nearly 2 hours. The trail wound up into the foothills, through stands of pine and oak, past other claims marked by diggings and the skeletal remains of sluices and cradles. It was beautiful country, wild and rugged, and Victoria felt something in her chest loosen as she rode. Here, away from the watching eyes and calculating stares, she could breathe. The Grady claim, when she found it, was disappointing. The diggings were overgrown, the entrance to what appeared to be a small tunnel was partially collapsed, and there was no equipment beyond some rotted timber and a rusted pan. Victoria dismounted and walked the property, trying to imagine what it must have looked like when it was being worked. The claim covered about 20 acres of hillside, marked at the corners by stakes that were barely still standing. She was examining what remained of the tunnel entrance when she heard horses approaching. Turning, she saw 3 riders coming up the trail. Her stomach sank when she recognized Thomas Fletcher in the lead, with 2 other miners from the boarding house behind him. "Miss Wright," Fletcher called out cheerfully, dismounting with a broad smile. "Thought you might come out here today. Figured you could use some company." "I'm fine on my own, Mr. Fletcher," Victoria said politely but firmly. "Oh, I'm sure you are," he said, his smile never wavering. "But this country can be dangerous for a lady alone. Mountain lions, bears, claim jumpers. Better to have someone with you." The other 2 men dismounted as well, spreading out slightly. Victoria felt a prickle of unease. They weren't threatening exactly, but their presence felt invasive, presumptuous. "As you can see, I'm perfectly safe," Victoria said, "and I prefer to assess my property privately." "Now, Miss Wright, there's no need to be unfriendly," one of the other men said. His name was Charles Wu, and he was younger than Fletcher, with an eager expression that reminded Victoria of an overeager puppy. "We just want to help. This claim's been dead for 2 years. You'll need experienced eyes to tell you if there's anything worth pursuing." Victoria opened her mouth to insist again that she wanted privacy when the sound of another horse made everyone turn. This rider was alone, coming from a different direction, higher up on the mountain trail. Even at a distance, Victoria could see he was different from the town miners. He sat his horse like he'd been born in the saddle, and as he drew closer, she saw he was bigger than any of the other men, tall and broad-shouldered with muscles evident even through his worn buckskin shirt. His hair was dark brown and hung past his shoulders, tied back loosely. His face was tanned and weathered, with a strong jaw shadowed by several days' worth of beard. He looked like he belonged to the wilderness, like the mountain itself had shaped him. Fletcher and the others noticed him too, and their friendly expressions cooled slightly. "Mountain man," Charles Wu muttered. The stranger rode up and stopped. His eyes, which Victoria now saw were a striking light brown, almost gold in the sunlight, moving from the miners to Victoria and back again. "Gentlemen," he said. His voice was deep and measured. "This lady sounds like she wants privacy. Might be you should give it to her." "This isn't your concern, Ezra," Fletcher said, his jaw tightening. "We're just offering neighborly assistance to Miss Wright." So this was Ezra. Victoria had heard Mrs. Chen mention him briefly. Ezra Vaughn, a mountain man who lived up in the high country and came down to Columbia, only occasionally for supplies. Mrs. Chen had spoken of him with a respect she didn't show the miners, mentioning that he'd once helped defend the Chinese camp from thugs trying to drive them out. Ezra's golden eyes met Victoria's directly. "Is that true, madam? You want these men here?" Victoria felt her spine straighten. Here was someone actually asking what she wanted rather than assuming. "No," she said clearly. "I don't." Ezra nodded once and looked back at Fletcher. "There's your answer." Fletcher's face reddened. "Now look here, Vaughn. You don't have any claim to help her. You're not even a proper miner." "Don't need to be," Ezra said calmly. "Just need to have manners, which you seem to be lacking." His hand rested casually on his thigh, near where a knife hung from his belt. He wasn't threatening exactly, but the implication was clear. The 3 miners exchanged glances. Fletcher looked like he wanted to argue further, but something in Ezra's steady gaze made him reconsider. "Fine," he said tersely. "Miss Wright, if you need real help, you know where to find me." He mounted his horse and the other 2 followed suit. They rode back down the trail, Fletcher's shoulders stiff with wounded pride. When they were gone, Victoria let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Ezra remained mounted, watching her with those unusual golden eyes. "Thank you," Victoria said. "They weren't dangerous, I think, but they weren't listening either." "Men get foolish around a pretty woman," Ezra said matter-of-factly. "Gets worse when they're lonely and there's money involved." "Money," Victoria frowned. Ezra's expression darkened slightly. You might want to know there's a wager going around town. Miners betting on who can win your favor first. Pots up to near $200 last I heard." Victoria felt her face flame hot, then go cold. "They're betting on me, like I'm some kind of race horse." "Something like that," Ezra said. He didn't sound approving. "Fool business, but men get stupid when pride and money mix." Victoria's hands clenched into fists. Anger burned through her embarrassment. Every offer of help, every friendly smile, it had all been about money and ego. That's why they all suddenly wanted to help me. It wasn't neighborly at all. "No, madam, it wasn't," Ezra agreed. He dismounted then, moving with an easy grace that belied his size. Up close, he was even more imposing, easily over 6 feet tall with broad shoulders and muscled arms evident under his shirt. But his expression, while serious, wasn't unkind. "If you want my opinion, you should ride back to town, sell this claim to one of the big operators and use the money to start fresh somewhere civilized." "I'm not selling," Victoria said immediately. "This claim is all I have left of my father. He never got to see it, never got to try. I'm not giving up without at least understanding what it is." Ezra studied her for a long moment. "You know anything about mining?" "No," Victoria admitted, "but I can learn." Something that might have been respect flickered across his face. "Learning mining theory and doing the work are different things. This claim's been abandoned for good reason. Probably played out." "Probably," Victoria agreed, "but I need to know for certain." She hesitated, then made a decision. "Mr. Vaughn, you clearly know this country. Would you be willing to look at this claim and give me an honest assessment? I can't pay much, but I can pay something." Ezra shook his head. "Don't want your money." Victoria's heart sank. Of course. Even the mountain man thought she was foolish. "I see. Well, thank you again for your help with those men." "Didn't say I wouldn't help," Ezra said. "Said I don't want your money. You're getting cheated enough already by this situation. I'll look at your claim, tell you what I think, and you don't owe me anything." Victoria blinked. "Why would you do that?" "Because you're being treated unfairly and I don't like it," Ezra said simply. "And because Mrs. Chen asked me to keep an eye out for you when I was in town yesterday getting supplies." "Mrs. Chen asked you?" "She's worried. Said you seem like you've got spine but no experience with how rough these mining camps can be." Ezra looked at the overgrown claim. "She's not wrong to worry." Victoria felt a rush of warmth for her landlady, followed by a return of her determination. "All right then. I accept your help, Mr. Vaughn, and thank you. Call me Ezra. Mr. Vaughn was my father." He walked over to the tunnel entrance and crouched down, examining the collapsed timbers. Victoria watched as he moved around the claim, his eyes sharp and assessing. He checked the tunnel entrance, examined the rock faces where digging had exposed the hillside, and even sifted through some of the old tailings piles. Finally, he stood and walked back to where Victoria waited. "It's not good news," he said. "Tunnel's not safe to enter without shoring it up, which would cost money and labor. The surface diggings don't show much promise. The rock here is wrong for silver. If there was ever anything here, it was probably a small vein that played out fast." Victoria's shoulders sagged. She'd expected it, but hearing it still hurt. "So it's worthless." "For silver mining, probably," Ezra said. "But the land itself isn't worthless. It's got good timber, water from that creek down the slope, and it's pretty country. Could be worth something to someone looking to build a homestead rather than dig for ore." "I can't homestead," Victoria said quietly. "I don't know the first thing about that kind of life." "No," Ezra agreed. "But you could sell it to someone who does, for more than a mining company would give you for a played-out claim." It made sense, but the thought of selling, of giving up the last piece of her father, made Victoria's chest ache. "I need to think about it," she said. Ezra nodded. "Fair enough." It's your land, your choice. But Miss Wright, you should know those miners aren't going to stop their foolishness until someone wins their bet or you leave town. And even then, there'll be men thinking you're available for courting whether you want it or not. I can handle unwanted attention, Victoria said, lifting her chin. I'm sure you can, Ezra said. But handling it and having peace are different things, just something to consider. He moved to his horse and mounted. I should get back, got traps to check. What do you trap? Victoria asked, curious despite herself. Whatever's worth trapping, Ezra said. Beaver mostly, some fox and marten, sell the pelts once or twice a year. He touched the brim of his hat. You take care, Miss Wright, and if those miners bother you again, you let Mrs. Chen know. She knows how to find me if needed. He rode off before Victoria could respond, heading up the mountain trail and disappearing into the pine trees. Victoria stood watching the spot where he'd vanished, feeling an odd mixture of relief and disappointment. He'd been brusque, certainly, but also honest and respectful in a way the town miners hadn't been. And there'd been something about him, something solid and capable, that made her feel safer just from having been in his presence. She rode back to Columbia slowly, her mind churning with thoughts. The claim was likely worthless for mining. She could sell it, but to whom and for how much? And what would she do after? She had no family, no home to return to. Her father's illness and death had consumed what little savings they'd had. She was truly alone in the world. Back in town, the attention was even worse. Word had apparently spread that she'd ridden out to her claim, and miners kept tipping their hats and offering greetings as she returned copper to Mrs. Chen's small stable behind the boarding house. Victoria kept her responses polite but brief, and retreated to her room as quickly as possible. That evening at supper, Mrs. Chen sat down across from Victoria after serving the meal. The dining room was full of miners, but Mrs. Chen's presence seemed to dampen their enthusiasm for approaching. You saw Ezra, Mrs. Chen said quietly. I did. Thank you for asking him to watch for me, Victoria said. He ran off some miners who weren't taking no for an answer, and he looked at my claim. And he says it's probably worthless for mining. Victoria pushed beans around her plate. He suggested I sell it as homestead land instead. Mrs. Chen nodded slowly. Ezra knows the mountains better than anyone. If he says the claim is no good, it's no good. He wouldn't lie to you. I believe that, Victoria said. Mrs. Chen, did you know about the bet, the miners wagering on me? Mrs. Chen's weathered face tightened with anger. I heard about it today. I gave those men in this house a piece of my mind about their foolishness, treating a respectable woman like a prize. She shook her head. Men are idiots when they get together. Despite everything, Victoria felt a small smile tug at her lips. Ezra said something similar. Ezra's got sense, Mrs. Chen said. He lives apart because he prefers it, but also because he doesn't think much of how people behave in towns. Can't say I blame him. Over the next 3 days, Victoria tried to figure out her next move. She visited the land office again and made discreet inquiries about selling the claim. Samuel Peters, the clerk, offered her $50 for it on behalf of a mining company, which Victoria knew was insultingly low. The land alone was worth more than that. Meanwhile, the miners continued their pursuit. Robert Patterson cornered her outside the general store and spent 20 minutes explaining how he could help her maximize the value of her property, only to look crestfallen when she politely declined. Charles Wu left a bouquet of wildflowers at the boarding house for her, which Mrs. Chen accepted with a disapproving frown. Thomas Fletcher tried a different approach, offering to introduce her to a banker who might give her a loan to work the claim, but Victoria saw through it immediately. The attention was exhausting. Victoria couldn't walk down the street without being accosted. Even men who weren't part of the original bet had started trying their luck, seeing her as a woman alone and therefore available. She began to understand what Mrs. Chen had meant about the roughness of mining camps. There were good people in Colombia, certainly, but there was also a kind of lawlessness, a sense that normal social rules didn't quite apply. On the fourth day, Victoria decided she needed to get out of town again. The walls were closing in, and she needed space to think. She borrowed copper again and rode out, not toward her claim this time, but just up into the hills where she could breathe. She found a spot where the creek widened into a small pool, surrounded by willows and pine. The water was clear and cold, probably snowmelt from higher up. Victoria dismounted and sat on a sun-warmed rock, letting the sound of running water soothe her nerves. She'd been there perhaps an hour when she heard a horse approaching. Her stomach tightened, wondering which miner had followed her this time, but when the rider appeared through the trees, it was Ezra. He looked surprised to see her. "Miss Wright, didn't expect anyone to be here." "I needed to get away from town," Victoria said. "Is this your land?" "I'm sorry, I didn't know." "It's not anybody's land," Ezra said, dismounting, "and you're welcome to be here." He led his horse to the water to drink, guessing the miners are still pestering you. "Constantly," Victoria said. "I can't even buy flour without someone offering to carry it for me, and then launching into a speech about their qualifications." She surprised herself by adding, "It's exhausting being treated like a prize instead of a person." Ezra nodded. "It'll get worse before it gets better. Bet's up to $300 now. Men are getting serious about it." Victoria felt sick. "I wish I could stop it. It's humiliating." Ezra was quiet for a moment, then said, "There is a way to stop it." "How?" "If you were being courted by someone, proper and official-like, the others would back off. Not all of them, but most. Men respect another man's claim." He paused. "Even if it's not real." Victoria stared at him. "Are you suggesting a fake courtship?" "I'm suggesting that if you had a man acting as your declared suitor, you'd get some peace," Ezra said. "And if that man was someone the miners knew they couldn't push around, they'd back off faster." "Someone like you," Victoria said slowly. "Someone like me," Ezra agreed. "I'm not part of their world. Don't care about their bet, and they know I'd make them regret it if they pushed. If I started calling on you proper-like, they'd leave you alone." Victoria's heart was beating faster. It was a practical solution, she could see that. But the idea of pretending a courtship felt strange and also oddly disappointing in a way she couldn't quite name. "Why would you do that?" she asked. "You barely know me." Ezra looked at her directly. "Because you're being treated poorly and I don't like it. Because Mrs. Chen asked me to help if I could and I owe her. And because you seem like a decent person in a bad situation. But you live in the mountains. You'd have to come to town, and you said yourself you don't like towns much." "I don't," Ezra admitted. "But I need to come down for supplies now and then anyway. I could make a point of calling on you when I do. Word would spread fast enough." Victoria considered it. It was practical, even clever, but something about it felt wrong, like lying. "What happens when I eventually leave Colombia?" "Won't people think you've been jilted?" Ezra shrugged. "Don't care what people think. Never have." "But I do," Victoria said quietly. "I don't want to lie to people, even people who are treating me badly." "Fair enough," Ezra said. He didn't seem offended. It was just a thought. They were quiet for a moment, the sound of the creek filling the silence. Victoria found herself studying Ezra when he wasn't looking directly at her. He was handsome in a rugged way, all sharp angles and tanned skin, but it was more than that. There was something steady about him, something that made her feel calmer just being near him. It was so different from the eager desperation of the town miners. "Can I ask you something?" Victoria said. "Go ahead." "Why do you live alone? Mrs. Chen said you prefer it, but is that really why?" Ezra's jaw tightened slightly. Lived in towns before. Sacramento for a while, then San Francisco. Worked regular jobs, played by society's rules. He picked up a small stone and tossed it into the creek. Found that people are mostly concerned with themselves. They'll use you if they can and turn on you if it benefits them. Got tired of it. Mountains don't lie. Animals don't pretend to be your friend while stabbing you in the back. There was pain in his words, old but not forgotten. Victoria wondered what had happened to make him so disillusioned. Not everyone is like that, she said softly. No, Ezra agreed. Not everyone. Mrs. Chen isn't, few others aren't, but enough are that I prefer the company of trees and rivers. That sounds lonely. Ezra looked at her then, really looked at her, and Victoria felt something shift in the air between them. Sometimes, he admitted, but loneliness is better than betrayal. Victoria understood that sentiment more than she wanted to admit. Her father's so-called friends had disappeared the moment his money was gone. The young man who'd been courting her in Sacramento had broken things off the day her father announced his illness. She'd learned about fair-weather affection the hard way. I understand, she said simply. Something in Ezra's expression softened. They sat in companionable silence for a while longer before Ezra stood and said he needed to check his trap lines. Victoria rode back to Columbia feeling more settled than she had in days, though she wasn't sure why. That evening, everything changed. Victoria was having supper in the boarding house dining room when raised voices erupted from the street outside. Mrs. Chen went to the window, her face darkening. It's those fool miners, she said. Arguing over the bet. Victoria's stomach sank. She went to the window as well and saw a crowd gathered outside the saloon. Thomas Fletcher and Robert Patterson were in the center, shouting at each other while other men egged them on or tried to pull them apart. Fletcher's claiming he should win because you spoke to him first, Mrs. Chen translated, though Victoria could hear enough to get the gist. Patterson says speaking doesn't count, it's about actual help given. This is absurd, Victoria said angrily. I'm going out there. Miss Wright, that's not wise, Mrs. Chen cautioned, but Victoria was already moving. She'd had enough. She pushed through the boarding house door and strode across the street to where the miners were gathered. The argument had escalated and Fletcher had his fists raised. Patterson was squaring up to meet him. Stop this, Victoria shouted. The men turned, surprised. The crowd quieted. This whole situation is disgusting, Victoria said, her voice shaking with anger. You're treating me like property, like something to be won. I'm a person with my own will, and I haven't given any of you permission to court me or help me or even think about me in whatever way you've been thinking. Miss Wright, Fletcher started, lowering his fists. We didn't mean any disrespect. You've done nothing but disrespect me since I arrived, Victoria shot back. This bet, this entire situation, it's humiliating and cruel, and I want it to stop immediately. Now hold on, Patterson said. We were just having a little fun and trying to help you besides. You need help with that claim. If I need help, I'll ask for it, Victoria said, and it won't be from any of you. A new voice spoke from the edge of the crowd. Ladies made herself clear, gentlemen. Everyone turned. Ezra stood there, his horse beside him, looking like he'd just ridden into town. He must have been coming in for supplies and heard the commotion. His presence immediately changed the atmosphere. Some of the miners looked nervous. Others looked resentful. This isn't your business, Vaughn, Patterson said, but he didn't sound entirely confident. When a woman is being harassed, it's any decent man's business, Ezra said calmly. He walked forward to stand beside Victoria, not touching her but close enough that his intention was clear. And since I'm courting Miss Wright myself, it's especially my business. The crowd went silent. Victoria's head whipped toward Ezra in shock. He wasn't even looking at her, his eyes fixed on the miners with calm certainty. "You're courting her," Fletcher said skeptically. "Since when?" "Since I decided to," Ezra said. "And since Miss Wright agreed to let me call on her proper. So whatever bet you've got going, you can end it now. She's spoken for." Victoria's mind was racing. He'd made the decision for her, declared a courtship without asking. She should be angry. She should contradict him right now. But as she looked at the crowd of miners, at their shocked and disappointed faces, at the way they were actually backing down for the first time since she'd arrived, she found she couldn't do it. "That's right," she heard herself say. "Ezra and I have an understanding." The lie felt heavy on her tongue, but the relief of seeing the miners' expressions change from predatory interest to resigned acceptance was undeniable. "An understanding," Patterson repeated. "Mighty convenient, that. Are you calling the lady a liar?" Ezra asked, his voice dropping to something dangerous. Patterson blanched. "No, no, of course not." He looked around at the other miners. "Well, boys, I guess that settles it. No winner. Bets off." There was grumbling, but the crowd began to disperse. The saloon keeper, Gerald Moore, apparently returned the money from the pot. Within minutes, the street was clearing. Victoria stood frozen, aware that she'd just committed herself to a charade. When the last of the miners had wandered away, Ezra finally looked at her. "Apologies for presuming," he said quietly, "but you looked like you needed rescuing." "I did," Victoria admitted, "but you should have asked first. If I'd asked, you would have said no," Ezra said. "You said earlier you didn't want to lie." "I still don't," Victoria said. "But you've put me in a position where I have to." Ezra's jaw tightened. "Then we'll make it not a lie." Victoria's breath caught. "What do you mean?" "I mean I'll court you for real," Ezra said. "Proper like, come to town once a week, take you walking, sit with you at supper. Give it enough time that when we end it, it looks natural and nobody thinks less of you." Victoria stared at him. "You do that? Actually court me just to make the lie true?" "Yes." "Why?" Ezra looked uncomfortable. "Already told you, you're being treated badly. This fixes it." There was something else in his eyes, though, something he wasn't saying. Victoria felt her heart beating faster. "And what if I don't want to be courted by you?" "Then tell me now," Ezra said simply. "I'll walk away and you can handle things your own way." Victoria opened her mouth, then closed it. Did she want him to walk away? The honest answer surprised her. No, she didn't. The thought of Ezra coming to town to see her, of spending time with him, of maybe getting to know the man behind the gruff exterior, it didn't seem like a burden. It seemed like something she might actually want. "All right," she said quietly, "we'll try it. A real courtship for as long as it makes sense." Something flickered across Ezra's face, too quick to read. "All right then," he said. "I'll come by Sunday afternoon. We'll take a walk. Let people see us together." "Sunday," Victoria agreed. Ezra nodded once, then mounted his horse and rode back out of town, leaving Victoria standing in the dusty street wondering what she'd just agreed to. Back at the boarding house, Mrs. Chen was waiting with a knowing look. "So, Ezra Vaughn is courting you." "It would seem so," Victoria said, still feeling dazed. "Is it real or is it for show?" Victoria sank into a chair in Mrs. Chen's private sitting room. "It started as for show. Now he says it's real. I don't know what it is." Mrs. Chen smiled, a rare expression on her weathered face. "Ezra's a good man. Hard man to know, but good underneath. You could do worse." "I barely know him," Victoria protested. "You'll learn," Mrs. Chen said. "And Miss Wright, I think you already like him more than you're admitting." Victoria couldn't deny it. There was something about Ezra that called to something in her, a matching wariness of the world, a shared understanding of being alone. And beneath his rough exterior, she'd glimpsed kindness and honor. It was more than she could say for most men she'd known. Sunday came sooner than Victoria expected. She dressed carefully in her best day dress, a soft blue cotton that brought out her eyes, and tried to ignore the nervous flutter in her stomach. This was practical, she reminded herself, a solution to a problem. The fact that her hands trembled slightly as she pinned up her hair had nothing to do with actual feelings. Ezra arrived at 2 o'clock precisely, riding into town looking uncomfortable in what were clearly his best clothes. A clean shirt, dark trousers, and a leather vest. His hair was still long but had been freshly washed and tied back neatly. He'd even trimmed his beard. The effect was striking. He looked like something out of a frontier painting, all masculine strength tempered with respectability. Victoria met him at the boarding house door, very aware of Mrs. Chen and several of the miners watching from windows. "Miss Wright," Ezra said formally, dismounting. "You look lovely." "Thank you," Victoria said, feeling her cheeks warm. "You clean up well yourself." Something that might have been amusement flickered in his golden eyes. "Shall we walk?" They walked through Columbia's Main Street, past the assay office and the general store, the bank and the church. People stared, some openly curious, others disapproving. Victoria could hear the whispers starting already. The mountain man and the eastern lady. What a pair. "I feel like an exhibit at a fair," Victoria murmured. "Let them look," Ezra said. "They'll get bored soon enough." They walked to the edge of town where the buildings gave way to oak trees and open meadow. Finally alone, some of the tension eased from Victoria's shoulders. "This must be torture for you," she said, "being on display like that." "It's not my favorite thing," Ezra admitted, "but it's bearable." "Why?" Victoria asked. "Why is this specifically bearable when you hate town so much?" Ezra was quiet for a long moment. They walked past a stand of pines, and he seemed to be gathering his words. "Because you're not like the rest of them," he finally said. "You're honest. You say what you mean, and you're not trying to use people for your own gain." "You don't know that," Victoria said. "You barely know me." "I know enough," Ezra said. "I've been watching people my whole life, learning to read them. It's how you survive. You're genuine, Miss Wright. That's rare." Victoria felt something warm unfurl in her chest. "Victoria," she said. "If we're courting, even pretend courting that's become real courting, you should call me Victoria." "Victoria," Ezra repeated, and her name sounded different in his deep voice, softer somehow. "And you should call me Ezra." "I already do," Victoria pointed out with a small smile. "True enough," Ezra said, and she caught the hint of a smile on his own lips. They walked for over an hour, conversation coming easier than Victoria had expected. Ezra told her about his life in the mountains, about tracking animals and reading weather in the clouds, about the pure silence of winter snow. Victoria told him about growing up in Sacramento, about her father's failed business ventures and his eternal optimism, even in the face of poverty, about the loneliness of losing the only family she had. By the time they returned to the boarding house, Victoria felt like she'd known Ezra far longer than she actually had. There was an ease between them, a comfort that shouldn't have existed so soon but did. "Thank you for the walk," Victoria said at the boarding house door. "I'll come by again next Sunday," Ezra said. "If that's agreeable." "It is," Victoria said. Then, impulsively, she added, "You could come sooner if you wanted. I mean, if you're coming to town anyway for supplies." Ezra's expression softened. "I'll keep that in mind." He tipped his hat and mounted his horse, riding out of Columbia as the sun began to sink toward the horizon. Victoria watched him go, Mrs. Chen's words echoing in her mind. "You already like him more than you're admitting." Maybe she did. Over the following weeks, the courtship that had started as pragmatic fiction became something undeniably real. Ezra came to town twice a week, ostensibly for supplies but really to see Victoria. They walked, they talked, and slowly, carefully, they learned each other. Victoria discovered that Ezra had a dry sense of humor that emerged when he was comfortable, that he was surprisingly well-read from long winter months with nothing but books for company, and that he had strong opinions about everything from politics to the best way to cure venison. She learned that he'd grown up in a homestead in Oregon, that his parents had died in a diphtheria outbreak when he was 17, and that he'd drifted for years before finding his place in the mountains. Ezra, in turn, discovered that Victoria was far stronger than she looked, that she had a stubborn streak a mile wide, and that she could make him laugh with her sharp observations about the absurdities of human behavior. He learned that she loved reading as much as he did, that she was trying to teach herself about geology and mineralogy from borrowed books, and that she had dreams of maybe, someday, finding a place where she truly belonged. The miners of Columbia watched with mixed reactions. Some were genuinely happy for Victoria, glad to see her settled with someone who would treat her well. Others were resentful, feeling cheated out of their chance. But none of them dared approach her anymore, not with Ezra Vaughn making his interest clear. 2 months after their courtship began, Ezra took Victoria up to his cabin. It was a long ride, higher into the mountains than she'd been before. The cabin sat in a clearing beside a stream, surrounded by towering pines. It was small but well built, with a stone chimney and real glass windows. "You built this yourself?" Victoria asked, awed. "Over 2 winters," Ezra said. "It's not fancy." "It's wonderful," Victoria said honestly. It was clean and organized inside, with handmade furniture and shelves full of books. Furs hung on the walls and supplies were neatly stored. It was the home of someone who lived deliberately, who took pride in self-sufficiency. "It's peaceful. That's why I love it," Ezra said. He showed her around, pointing out the various features: the root cellar he'd dug, the smokehouse for preserving meat, the neat garden plot where he grew vegetables in summer. They sat outside as the sun set, the forest around them alive with evening sounds. Victoria felt more relaxed than she had in months, maybe years. Up here, the pressures of Columbia seemed distant and unimportant. "Victoria," Ezra said, his voice serious, "I need to tell you something." Her heart jumped. "All right." "This started as me trying to help you," Ezra said, not looking at her but staring out at the darkening trees. "But it's not that anymore. Not for me. I've come to care for you, genuinely care for you, and I need to know if you feel the same or if this is still just practical for you." Victoria's breath caught. She'd known this moment was coming, had felt the shift in her own heart over the past weeks. "It's not practical anymore," she said quietly. "I care for you too, Ezra, more than I expected to, more than I know what to do with." Ezra turned to look at her then, and the intensity in his golden eyes made her shiver. "I'm not an easy man," he said. "I'm set in my ways, I live rough. I can't offer you a fancy house in a city or fine dresses or society parties. I don't want those things," Victoria said. "I want honesty and respect and someone who sees me as an equal. You've given me all of that." Ezra reached out and took her hand, his calloused palm warm against hers. "I want you to know what you'd be getting into. Life with me would be hard sometimes. Winters up here are brutal. The work never stops. It's lonely at times, even with company." "Life anywhere is hard," Victoria said. "At least here it would be honest, and I wouldn't be alone, neither would you." Something fierce and tender crossed Ezra's face. He raised her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles gently. "Victoria Wright, would you consider marrying me?" Victoria felt tears prick her eyes, but they were good tears, happy tears. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I'll marry you." Ezra pulled her close and Victoria went willingly, feeling his strong arms wrap around her. She'd never felt so safe, so certain of anything. This rough mountain man with his careful honor and hidden gentleness had won her heart without even trying. They were married 3 weeks later in Columbia's small church. Mrs. Chen stood up with Victoria, and a trapper friend of Ezra's named William served as his witness. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt, and when Ezra kissed his bride, there were genuine cheers from the assembled crowd. The miners who'd bet on Victoria came to the wedding, most of them shamefaced and apologetic. Thomas Fletcher actually congratulated Ezra sincerely and told Victoria she'd chosen well. Robert Patterson gave them a set of tin dishes as a wedding gift, which Victoria accepted graciously. The celebration afterward at the boarding house was modest but joyful. Mrs. Chen had cooked a feast, and someone brought out a fiddle. Victoria danced with her husband, laughing as he admitted he'd never learned proper dance steps but was willing to try. They stumbled through something that was part waltz, part improvisation, and entirely perfect. As the evening wound down, Ezra and Victoria rode up to the mountain cabin together. Victoria had sold her claim to a homesteader from back east for $200, far more than the mining company had offered. She'd used some of the money to buy practical supplies for her new life and had saved the rest. Everything she owned in the world fit in 2 trunks strapped to a pack horse following them up the mountain trail. The cabin looked warm and welcoming with lamplight glowing in the windows. Ezra had been up the day before, preparing it for his bride. Inside, Victoria found fresh wildflowers in a tin cup on the table, the bed made up with clean linens, and the fire burning warm in the hearth. "Welcome home," Ezra said softly. "Home," Victoria repeated, testing the word. She looked around at the small cabin, so different from anything she'd ever imagined for herself, and felt rightness settle deep in her bones. Yes, home. That night in her husband's arms, Victoria learned what it meant to be truly cherished. Ezra was gentle and passionate in equal measure, treating her with reverence that made her heart ache. In the darkness of the mountain cabin, surrounded by wilderness and possibility, Victoria felt the last pieces of her old fearful self fall away. She was remade here, not as someone's property or someone's burden, but as herself, chosen and choosing in return. The first year of marriage was an education for both of them. Victoria learned to cure meat and tan hides, to read animal tracks and predict weather. Her hands, which had been soft and uncalloused, grew strong from work. She learned to shoot Ezra's rifle and became proficient enough to bring down a deer. She learned the rhythms of mountain life, the fierce isolation of winter when snow blocked the trails for weeks at a time, the explosion of life in spring when wildflowers carpeted the meadows, the long golden days of summer when work consumed every hour of daylight, and the crisp beauty of autumn when they harvested their garden and prepared for the cycle to begin again. Ezra, in turn, learned to share his space and his life. He'd been alone for so long that having a partner took adjustment. But Victoria's presence softened something in him, brought warmth to the cabin that had nothing to do with the fire. He found himself talking more, laughing more, feeling more. The loneliness he'd thought he preferred to betrayal revealed itself as the defense mechanism it was, and he let it go. They went to Columbia together once a month for supplies and to visit Mrs. Chen, who'd become like family to both of them. The town watched their marriage with interest, noting how happy Victoria seemed, how Ezra smiled more. The bet that had started it all became a cautionary tale parents told their sons about respecting women. In the second year of their marriage, Victoria discovered she was pregnant. The realization filled her with equal parts joy and terror. Ezra's reaction was pure delight mixed with fierce protectiveness. He insisted she do less of the heavy work, though Victoria argued she was pregnant, not broken. They made preparations. Ezra built a cradle from pine wood, sanding it smooth and carving deer and birds into the sides. Victoria sewed baby clothes and blankets, her needle flashing in lamplight through the long winter evenings. Mrs. Chen came to stay a month before the baby was due, bringing her knowledge of midwifery and her calm presence. Their son was born on a clear May morning in 1876, arriving with a healthy wail that echoed off the mountain peaks. They named him Thomas, after no one in particular, simply because they both liked the name. He had his mother's green eyes and his father's dark hair, and from the beginning he seemed to belong to the wilderness as much as his parents did. Ezra was a devoted father, though his methods were unconventional. He carried Thomas strapped to his chest as he checked trap lines, teaching him the sounds of the forest before he could even speak. Victoria would watch her husband with their son and feel her heart swell with love. This was family. This was belonging. 2 years later, a daughter joined them, Catherine, with her father's golden eyes and her mother's copper hair. Then, 3 years after that, another son, James, who was the image of his older brother. The cabin grew more crowded but also more filled with love and laughter. Victoria had worried before Thomas was born that she wouldn't know how to be a mother. But she found that love taught her what books and preparation couldn't. She was patient and firm, nurturing and practical. She taught her children to read by firelight, to appreciate the beauty around them, to treat all people with respect regardless of their station. Ezra taught them wilderness skills, how to track and hunt, how to read the land, how to survive. Together, they raised children who were strong and kind, capable and compassionate. As the years passed, Ezra built additions to the cabin to accommodate their growing family. The original single room became 3, then 4. They built a proper barn for the horses and goats they'd acquired. The garden expanded. The place that had been Ezra's retreat became a true homestead, a family home. Columbia changed too. The silver played out eventually, as such things do, and many of the miners moved on to new strikes. The town shrank but stabilized, becoming more of a farming community than a mining camp. Mrs. Chen's boarding house remained a constant, though she grew older and eventually took on a partner to help run it. A widow named Sarah from back east who proved to be a good friend as well as business partner. Through it all, Ezra and Victoria's love deepened. The passion of their early days matured into something more profound, a partnership built on mutual respect, shared work, and absolute trust. They had disagreements, certainly. Victoria could be stubborn, and Ezra could be too protective. But they'd learned to talk through problems, to compromise, to put their family first. On their 10th anniversary, Ezra took Victoria back to the spot by the creek where he'd first suggested the fake courtship. They hadn't been there in years, too busy with children and work. But the children were with Mrs. Chen for the night, and Ezra had insisted on the trip. "I wanted to tell you something," Ezra said as they sat on the same sun-warmed rocks where they'd sat a decade before. "I don't think I've ever properly thanked you." "For what?" Victoria asked, confused. "For taking a chance on a gruff mountain man who didn't have much to offer except himself," Ezra said. "For seeing something in me worth loving, for building this life with me." Victoria took his hand, larger and more weathered than it had been 10 years ago, but still the hand that had held hers through births and illnesses, through harsh winters and abundant harvests. "You had everything to offer," she said. "You offered me respect, honesty, and love. You offered me a home. That's everything that matters." Ezra kissed her then, soft and sweet, and Victoria felt the same flutter in her stomach that she'd felt as a new bride. Some things, she thought, didn't fade with time. They returned home to find their cabin filled with the chaos of 3 energetic children, and Victoria laughed as Thomas tried to explain how James had gotten mud all over Mrs. Chen's clean floor, and Catherine had tried to fix it, but had only made it worse. This was her life now, messy and loud and absolutely perfect. Years continued to pass in their steady rhythm. The children grew. Thomas became a serious boy who loved learning and wanted to be a doctor. Catherine was wild and free, happiest on horseback racing through the mountain meadows. James was the peacemaker, gentle and kind, who seemed to collect every stray animal in the territory. Victoria and Ezra grew older together, their hair gaining threads of silver, their bodies bearing the marks of hard work and good living. But they were healthy and strong, and their love remained the bedrock of their family. When Thomas was 18 and preparing to leave for medical school in San Francisco, a decision that both thrilled and terrified his parents, Victoria and Ezra took stock of their life. They sat on the porch of their cabin, now a sprawling structure that bore little resemblance to the simple shelter it had been, and watched the sunset paint the mountains gold and purple. "You ever regret it?" Ezra asked. "Giving up the possibility of city life, fancy things, ease?" Victoria looked at him in genuine surprise. "Never, not once. This life, this family, it's everything I never knew I wanted," she smiled. "Though I do regret that awful bet those miners made." "Don't," Ezra said. "If they hadn't been such fools, I might never have had the push I needed to step in. I'd been watching you since you arrived in town, thinking you were the most interesting woman I'd ever seen. But I never would have approached you if circumstances hadn't forced my hand. You'd been watching me." Victoria said, delighted by this revelation after so many years. Ezra actually looked embarrassed, a rare sight. "From a distance. I thought you were beautiful and brave, coming west alone like that, but I figured a woman like you wouldn't want anything to do with a mountain hermit." "Shows what you know," Victoria teased. "I wanted everything to do with you. I just didn't realize it until you gave me the chance to know you." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to emerge. Somewhere in the house, Catherine was arguing with James about something. Thomas was packing in his room, preparing for his great adventure. It was a normal evening, precious in its normalcy. "I love you," Ezra said quietly. "More now than the day I married you, and I loved you plenty then." "I love you too," Victoria said, leaning against his solid shoulder. "Forever." And she meant it. This life they'd built, this family they'd created, it was her legacy, far more valuable than any silver claim could ever have been. She'd come to Columbia, California, alone and uncertain, and she'd found everything that mattered. Love, purpose, home, and a partner who'd chosen her freely and been chosen in return. As the mountain night settled around them, full of cricket song and cool breeze, Victoria Wright Vaughn felt complete. The miner's bet that had seemed so humiliating had, in the strangest way, been a blessing. It had brought her to Ezra, and Ezra had brought her to this life. Not the life she'd planned or even imagined, but the life that was meant to be hers all along, in the end. That was all anyone could hope for. To find where they belonged and who they were meant to belong with. Victoria had found both, high in the California mountains, in the arms of a man who'd ended a foolish wager and asked for her hand, not because he wanted to win, but because he'd already lost his heart.